The dust settled slow along the ridge that separated the Callaway land from the open range, and the man riding along it looked like he belonged to neither. His horse, a dun-colored quarter horse named Pepper, picked her way carefully along the rocky trail as the sun burned low and orange behind the western hills. The rider sat easy in the saddle, one hand loose on the reins, his hat pulled down against the last of the afternoon glare. He had been riding since before dawn, and the miles had accumulated behind him the way debt does, quietly, steadily, without mercy. His name was Cole Hargrove, and he had not spoken it aloud in 3 days. He had been working his way west from the Panhandle, following seasonal work the way some men follow rivers, because the work was there, and because stopping felt more dangerous than moving. He was 41 years old, lean in the way that comes from years of honest labor and irregular meals, with hands that bore the permanent stain of rope and leather and Texas soil. His face was the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had simply become more itself with age, sharper at the jaw, deeper around the eyes, weathered into something that looked like it had been tested and had not broken. He came over the ridge as the day gave up its last heat, and what he saw below stopped him cold enough that Pepper flicked her ears back, sensing the change in her rider. The ranch spread below him like something from another era. The main house was enormous, white, painted limestone with wide wraparound porches and a red metal roof that caught the dying sun and threw it back like a signal fire. The outbuildings were painted to match, a dozen of them at least, arranged with the kind of deliberate order that spoke of money and care and someone who paid attention to details. Cattle dotted the pastures as far as he could see, red Herefords mostly, well fed and unhurried. The fencing was new. The barn was the biggest he had seen since he had worked a spread outside Amarillo years ago, before everything changed. He almost turned Pepper around. But his canteen was empty, and his provisions were down to a handful of jerky and a can of peaches he had been rationing for 2 days, and the nearest town was another 15 miles by his reckoning. He rode down. The woman appeared on the porch before he reached the gate, and she stood watching him come with her arms crossed and her chin slightly raised, which was not an unfriendly posture exactly, but was not a welcoming one either. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, he guessed, though she wore it the way some women do, not fighting it, just carrying it with the same self-possession she likely carried everything else. Her hair was silver, streaked and pulled back, and she was dressed practically in dark jeans and a pearl-snap shirt the color of slate. She did not reach for a phone or call for anyone, and she did not back toward the door. She simply stood and watched him approach, evaluating. He stopped Pepper at the gate and touched the brim of his hat. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to ride up unannounced. I was wondering if I might water my horse and fill my canteen before I push on." She studied him for a moment with eyes that were dark and direct and missed nothing. "Where are you headed?" "West," he said, which was honest if not specific. "On your own. Just me and Pepper." The woman looked at the horse with what seemed like genuine appraisal, taking in the animal's condition, the quality of the tack, the horse's hooves, the way the animal stood quiet and responsive. Whatever she was assessing, she seemed to reach some conclusion, because her posture shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but opening. "Come in," she said. "There's a trough by the barn. I'll have Maria put together some supper if you haven't eaten." He had not intended to accept more than water, but the offer of food landed somewhere in his chest in a way that embarrassed him slightly, and he accepted because refusing would have required more pride than he currently possessed. He led Pepper through the gate, and the woman walked ahead of him toward the barn without looking back, which he took as both an instruction and a test. Her name was Margaret Callaway, and she told him so at the supper table as plainly as she told him everything else, directly, without decoration or apology. She was the widow of Robert Calloway, who had died 14 months ago of a heart attack at the age of 62, while walking the south pasture on a Tuesday morning. She said this without searching for sympathy in his face, which he respected. She said it the way you say something that is true and that you have made your peace with, even if the peace is not complete. The ranch was 500 acres, she told him. It had been in Robert's family for 3 generations. She had grown up in San Antonio and come to this land as a bride at 24, and had spent 31 years learning to love it the way Robert loved it, which was without reservation or qualification. She loved it now. That was not the problem. The problem, she explained over roasted chicken and cornbread that her housekeeper Maria had produced with the easy expertise of long practice, was that the ranch was too much for one woman, and the men she had hired since Robert's death had been either incompetent or dishonest or both. The last foreman had run off 3 months ago, owing her nearly $8,000 in wages she had paid in advance, along with 2 of her best saddle horses and enough equipment to stock a smaller operation. The hands had scattered after him. She was running the property now with Maria's husband Ernesto and a teenage boy from town who came on weekends, and it was not enough. She did not tell him any of this as a prelude to an offer. She told him because he had asked how she was managing, and she answered honestly, which was apparently her default mode. He asked her about the cattle operation, and she answered with the kind of precision that told him she knew what she was talking about: carrying capacity, water access, the quality of her hay, contracts, the vet she used, the sale barn she preferred. She had learned from Robert and had been paying attention for 31 years, and the knowledge was in her now, but the physical labor of management was more than she could sustain alone. He listened and asked good questions, and she answered them, and somewhere in the middle of the meal the conversation shifted from practical to something adjacent to honest, the way conversations sometimes do when 2 private people find themselves unexpectedly comfortable. "You've worked cattle before," she said. "It was not a question. Most of my adult life," he said. "What pulled you off your last place?" He was quiet for a moment, and she did not fill the silence, which he noted and appreciated. "It ended," he said finally, "the way things do." She accepted that and did not push, and he was grateful, because the full answer was longer and more painful than supper conversation warranted, and she seemed to understand this without being told. After the meal she walked him out to the porch, and they stood in the night air, which had cooled to something civilized, and she looked out over her darkened land with the expression of someone calculating in their head. "I need someone who knows what they're doing," she said, "not a boy to follow orders, someone who can manage an operation." "I noticed," he said. She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly before you say anything." He waited. "I have an agreement with my attorney and my accountant. If I don't have a working foreman in place by the 1st of next month, they have the authority to list the property for sale. Robert's brother has been pushing for the sale for 2 years. He has no interest in ranching. He wants the land value and the mineral rights, and he's been patient, but he's getting less patient." She paused. "I won't let this land go, not while I can prevent it." "I understand," Cole said, though he wasn't yet sure where she was heading. "I don't know you," she said. "You rode up out of nowhere this evening, and you could be anyone. What I do know is that you handle your horse well. You asked intelligent questions about my operation, and you didn't lie to me about being hungry." She paused. "That last one matters more than you might think. The man before you lied about everything, starting with his name." Cole said nothing. "Here is what I am proposing," Margaret said. "You stay tonight. Tomorrow I want you to spend the day on this property, the whole 500 acres. Walk it, ride it, do whatever you need to do to understand it. Talk to Ernesto, look at my books if you want. At the end of the day, you tell me honestly whether you think this operation is viable and whether you think you can run it." She looked back out at the darkness beyond the porch light. "If your answer is yes, I will offer you the foreman position, fair wages, a place to sleep, and a percentage of any efficiency gains above last year's numbers." He was quiet for a moment. It was a serious offer. It was exactly the kind of situation he had been avoiding for 3 years. A place, a commitment, roots forming before you could stop them. "And if my answer is no," he asked, "then I will thank you for your honest assessment, and you can be on your way with a full canteen and 2 days of provisions." He looked out at the dark land, and something in him was tired of moving, though he had not let himself acknowledge it until this moment. "All right," he said, "I'll spend the day." She showed him to the bunkhouse, which was clean and equipped, and spoke of the same orderly attention she gave everything else. He lay on a real mattress for the first time in weeks, and stared at the ceiling and told himself he was only staying because his horse needed the rest. He was up before dawn. He moved through the property with the systematic attention of someone who had done this many times, checking fence lines, assessing pasture quality, looking at the condition of the water tanks in the windmill that fed the northern pasture. Ernesto was a compact, quiet man in his 60s who had worked the Callaway land for 20 years, and he answered Cole's questions with the careful economy of someone who had learned to withhold judgment until judgment was warranted. By mid-morning the two of them were working comfortably side by side, and Ernesto showed him the equipment shed and the state of the machinery and the hay supply, and Cole understood the operation, the way you understand a piece of land when you give it your full attention. He spent 2 hours with the books that afternoon, sitting at the desk in the small ranch office with the ledgers and the contracts spread before him. Margaret left him alone with them, which was either trust or a test, and he treated it as both. The operation was viable. More than viable, it was a good ranch that had suffered a year of mismanagement and grief, not fundamental decline. The bones were sound, the land was sound, the cattle were sound. What it needed was consistency and competence, and someone who would stay. He found her on the porch at the end of the day, sitting with a glass of iced tea and looking at nothing in particular, and he sat down across from her in the other porch chair and told her what he had found thoroughly and honestly, including the 2 fence sections on the eastern boundary that needed replacement before fall, and the windmill bearing that was starting to fail, and the hay contract that was overpriced relative to the current market. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and then said, "Your assessment. The ranch is sound," he said. "It needs a foreman who knows what he's doing. You were right about that. And the position." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Before I answer, there's something you should know." She looked at him steadily. "My name," he said. "My full name is Cole Robert Hargrove." Something changed in her face, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The color shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the fading light, and she went very still, the way a person goes still when something they thought was safely in the past arrives without warning at the front door. "Cole Hargrove," she repeated very quietly. "Yes, ma'am." She stood up slowly from the chair and walked to the porch railing and put her hands on it and stood with her back to him for a long moment. When she turned around, her eyes were different, not afraid, not angry, but recalibrated in some fundamental way, as if she were looking at the situation from a new angle that changed everything she thought she had understood about the evening. "Robert talked about you," she said. "He had not expected that, and he let it show." "He never told me why you left," she said. "He always said that was your story to tell if you wanted to tell it. but he talked about you. When he was thinking about the land and who he trusted with it, your name came up more than once." Cole was quiet. He looked at his hands. "Robert Calloway was my uncle," he said. "My mother's brother. I worked this land for 3 summers when I was 17, 18, 19. It's where I learned ranching." Margaret let out a long breath that was not quite a sigh. "I know," she said. "I was here for your last summer. We didn't meet properly, you were out on the range most of the time, but I was here." He nodded. "You left before the wedding," she said. There was no accusation in it. She was simply placing events in order. "There were circumstances," he said. "I know about the circumstances," she said, and her voice was careful and measured, and suggested she had carried some knowledge for a long time without knowing quite what to do with it. He looked up at her. "Robert told me the summer before he died," she said, "when he knew his heart was getting worse, and he started the kind of talking that men do when they think they might not have much time." She came back and sat down across from him again, and her hands were folded in her lap and her back was straight. "He told me about the argument, about the money, about what his father accused you of taking." Cole was very still. "He told me you didn't take it," she said. "He knew it wasn't you. He said it had been his brother, Robert's brother, your uncle by marriage, who had taken the money and let the accusation stand because it was convenient." She paused. "Robert said he had been a coward about it, that he should have spoken up 20 years earlier, and he hadn't, and he was sorry for it." The porch was very quiet. Somewhere in the darkness a night bird called once, and was answered by silence. "He was going to try to find you," she said. "He had started asking around, and then he had the heart attack." She looked at her hands. "And then you rode up my lane this evening." Cole did not say anything for a long moment. He was thinking about a 22-year-old version of himself riding away from this land on a hot August morning with nothing but what he could carry, and an accusation he couldn't disprove, and a fury he had spent the next 2 decades trying to work down to something manageable. "He was a good man," Cole said finally. "Robert, yes," she agreed, "he was. He wasn't perfect, but he was good." "I don't blame him," Cole said, and discovered as he said it that this was largely true. He had blamed Robert for years. In the abstract way you blame people who had the power to fix something and didn't. But the blame had worn thin over time, the way most things do when you carry them long enough. "He would want you here," Margaret said. "I don't say that to manipulate you. I say it because I believe it's true, and because I think you deserve to know it." Cole looked out at the dark land that had been the first land he ever loved, where he had learned to read cattle, learned to read weather, learned that 500 acres could be a whole world if you paid attention to it properly. He had ridden away from it and spent 22 years building knowledge and competence and moving from place to place, so that no single place could hurt him the way this one had. He thought about Pepper in the barn, well fed and rested. He thought about the feel of the land under his feet that morning, the particular way this soil smelled after a dry stretch, the quality of the light at dawn coming over the eastern ridge. The position, he said. Margaret looked at him. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition." She waited. "I'd like to spend 1 day a year going over the books with your attorney," he said. "Independent audit, everything transparent. Given what happened last time, I think that's fair to both of us." Something in her face that had been carefully composed loosened slightly into what might have been, on a less self-contained woman, relief. "That's more than fair," she said. "Then we have an agreement," he said. She extended her hand across the porch, and he shook it. And the handshake was firm and brief, and meant what handshakes are supposed to mean, which is increasingly rare. That night he lay in the bunkhouse again and listened to the sounds of the property, a horse shifting in a stall, a coyote somewhere distant and harmless, the faint creak of the windmill in north pasture, the bearing that would need attention in the morning. He knew this land's sounds the way you know the sounds of something you loved before you knew you loved it, and finding them unchanged after more than 2 decades was a thing that sat in his chest in a way he didn't have language for. He thought about Robert walking the south pasture on a Tuesday morning and not coming back. He thought about a young Margaret he had barely registered one summer, now silver, streaked and straight, backed and running 500 acres on the strength of her will and the help of an old man and a weakened boy. He thought about Robert's brother, who had taken money and let a 19-year-old take the blame and slept fine for 2 decades and now wanted the mineral rights. He thought about the fact that life is not particularly interested in being fair, and that the best you can do is position yourself for the moments when it accidentally is. He was up before dawn. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to reorganize itself. Cole hired 2 experienced hands, one he had worked with years ago in the Panhandle, a quiet, capable man named Dunn, who came for the wages and stayed because the operation was being run properly. One he found through Ernesto's recommendation, a young woman named Petra, who had grown up on a goat operation and had the kind of instinctive animal sense that you cannot teach. The eastern fence was repaired. The windmill bearing was replaced. The hay contract was renegotiated at a rate that saved Margaret over $3,000 before the year was out. Margaret moved through the property with the same self-possessed attention she brought to everything, and she and Cole developed the working language that good operations require: direct, efficient, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that the land came first. She did not treat him like a ghost of the past. She treated him like the foreman he was, which was more useful and more respectful. On the evenings when they sat on the porch after supper, which happened with increasing regularity as the season turned, the conversation was sometimes about the ranch and sometimes about 31 years she had spent loving this land, and occasionally, carefully, about the summers he had spent here as a young man learning everything that had carried him through the decades since. He told her more of it than he had expected to tell anyone. She listened in the way that good listeners do, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving what was said, holding it with appropriate care. He told her about the morning he had ridden away at 19, and how he had looked back once from the ridge, the same ridge he had come over 3 months ago, and told himself he would not look back again. "And here you are," she said. "And here I am," he agreed. Robert Calloway's brother came in October, driving a leased SUV and wearing city clothes that looked wrong against the land. His name was Douglas, and he was 60 years old and prosperous in the blunt, unsatisfied way of men who have always gotten what they wanted through mechanism rather than merit. He walked the porch and shook Margaret's hand, and looked at Cole with the careful blankness of a man who has been told something and is trying to process it. "Hargrove," Douglas said. "Calloway," Cole said. The two of them stood for a moment in a specific silence that held 22 years and a false accusation, and whatever Douglas was now deciding to do with his face about it. "I heard you came back," Douglas said. "I did," Cole said. Douglas looked at the land and at the repaired fence visible from the drive and at the cattle in the near pasture and at the evidence everywhere of competent management. He seemed to be recalculating. "The ranch is doing well," Margaret said pleasantly from the porch. It was not an accident that she said it when she did. Douglas had lunch and left before supper and did not mention the sale. He called Margaret's attorney 2 weeks later and formally withdrew any claim to management oversight, which was the legal mechanism through which he had been pushing his agenda. The attorney called Margaret, and she walked out of the house and across the yard and found Cole fixing a section of the corral fence and told him, and he straightened up and looked at her and nodded. Once, good, he said. Yes, she said. She walked back to the house, and he went back to the fence, and the land was quiet around them both, and the sky was enormous, and the cattle were doing what cattle do, and the windmill in the north pasture was turning with its new bearing, smooth and without complaint. Winter came early that year, the way winters sometimes do in that part of Texas, not dramatically, but with a steady, purposeful cold that moved in from the north and stayed. Cole spent the nights in the bunkhouse and the days on the land, and the work was the kind of work that asks everything of you and gives back exactly what you put in, which is the only fair bargain available. On a Thursday evening in December, he was sitting on the bunkhouse steps, watching the stars come out when Margaret walked across the yard with a cup of coffee and handed it to him and sat down on steps beside him, which she had not done before. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, which was true. "Is this place what you need it to be?" she asked. He thought about the question seriously, the way she asked it seriously. "I think so," he said. "I think it might be." She nodded and sat with him for a while in the cold without saying anything, and the land was quiet in the specific way that land is quiet when it has been well tended, not empty, but settled. At rest in the way that things at rest are not diminished but conserved. He had ridden up that lane 4 months ago with an empty canteen and no particular destination, and he had said his name aloud and watched a woman freeze because the world is stranger and more interconnected than it pretends to be. And now here he was on the steps of a bunkhouse on 500 acres that he had loved at 19 and walked away from and come back to without planning it, drinking cold weather coffee next to a woman who was rebuilding the same life he was rebuilding from different raw materials towards something neither of them had fully named yet. He thought about his Uncle Robert, who had been a good man and not a perfect one, walking the south pasture on a Tuesday morning with his heart about to give out, perhaps thinking about the conversation he had not yet had. Some things arrive too late. Some things arrive exactly when they need to. Pepper moved in the barn. The stars arranged themselves in the old patterns. The land held everything it had always held, the work, the debt, the weather, the small daily decisions that accumulate over years into something you recognize, finally, as home. Cole Hargrove finished his coffee and went inside and slept well, which was something he had not done consistently in a very long time. Outside, the 500 acres went about their nighttime business of being exactly what they were, not promised to anyone, not owing anyone, but held now by someone who knew their every fence, line and water source, and the particular way the light hit the eastern ridge at dawn, which was a kind of ownership that no deed recorded and no court enforced, but that was, in the end, the only kind that mattered.